Wait, what? What? Gliders? Yep, yeah, gliders sounds okay. That sounds okay. They crashed. Uh-huh. Well, wait. So, did they capture them? No, they're all dead. Ah, yeah, the commando order. Yeah. Well, that sucks. Okay. See ya. November 20th, 1942. Kurt Zeitzler, German Army Chief of Staff, has confidently proclaimed that the Soviets are in no position to mount any sort of major offensive, certainly not in the south of the Eastern Front. He is historically wrong, however, because this week the Soviets launch a huge counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week in Stalingrad, the Germans launched Operation Hubertus, a final offensive to try and win the battle there before the winter arrives in force, though the cold and snows are in fact already there. Things were not going well for them in the Caucasus, though, as an Axis offensive was called off after heavy panzer losses. The first part of the naval battle of Guadalcanal claimed the lives of 2 American admirals, but the major news was Operation Torch, the huge, successful Allied invasion of Vichy French North African possessions, which had as its byproduct a German invasion of Vichy France itself, which it looks like Germany will try to run more directly in future. The Allies are also still advancing in North Africa from the east as well, after breaking through Erwin Rommel's forces 2 weeks ago at El Alamein. In fact, Bernard Montgomery's offensive reaches Derna now on the 15th, and Benghazi on the 18th, taking that at the end of the week. This week, Rommel writes to his wife, "What will become of the war if we lose North Africa? How will it finish? I wish I could get free of these terrible thoughts." The advance from the west, the race to Tunis, also continues, with some possible aid, as on the 14th in Tunisia itself, General Georges Barré moves French troops away from coastal towns, sort of semi-preparing to go over to the Allies. He's waiting to see if Allied troops will arrive in time to support him versus the Germans. Well, on the 15th, the British 36th Brigade captures Tabarka, inside the Tunisian border with Algeria. US troops take the airfield near Tebessa. The Germans do have over 10,000 men and growing daily in Tunisia under Walter Nering after flying them in like crazy. They also have over 100 combat planes on former French all-weather bases that are closer to what will likely be the front. The Allies must use temporary landing bases further away. The 16th, British paratroops take Souk El Arba and nearly reach Beja by the end of the day. However, there's a little hitch in command concerning François Darlan, former commander of the Vichy French Armed Forces, who's been tapped to be in local charge by the Allies. General de Gaulle announces that he and his Free French supporters do not accept Darlan's authority. Many British politicians are worried too about cooperating with a former member of the Vichy government. The Americans have always been much more ready to favor Vichy than the British, and therefore see nothing wrong with such a useful arrangement. Anyhow, on the 19th, Barré's troops at Medjez El Bab fight off direct German attacks and get reinforcements from the British and Americans. He and his forces are now with the Allies. They'll have an easier time getting supplies than the Allies have for quite a while, for the Axis siege of Malta is now most definitely over. In fact, from the 17th to the 20th, Operation Stone Age, a convoy there from Gibraltar, is on the move. None of the freighters is lost, and of the 13-ship cruiser and destroyer escort, only 1 ship is even hit by the enemy, though it is pretty badly damaged and 155 people lose their lives. In what may or may not still be Vichy France this week, Philippe Pétain gives Pierre Laval authority to issue decrees in his own name, and today, as the week ends, Laval broadcasts his support for Germany. He believes Germany will win the war, and the alternative is Jews and communists. Germany is certainly fighting very hard against the communists this week over in Stalingrad as Operation Hubertus continues. After 2 months of fighting in the city, Barricade finally falls the 14th. But the fighting grinds on the next few days, without the German 6th Army taking much more ground, and snow falls on the 16th. The Germans prepare for one more final assault. Vasily Chuikov's Soviet 62nd Army has only about 47,000 men total left and 19, repeat, just 19 tanks, and those men on the west of the Volga are in three groups. There's Gorokhov with maybe 1,000 men up in Spartanovka, Yudnikov with 400 or so men cut off next to Barikady, and the remnants of 5 divisions to the south. Gorokhov, on November 17th, faced what looked like certain annihilation. 16th Panzer Division was about to roll over his dreadfully enfeebled garrison, scraping up his last reserves, cooks, drivers, anyone from the rear services. Gorokhov put 300 men in the line. In contact with Yeremenko and Chuikov by phone, Gorokhov received orders just to hold on, and in return, he was promised the kind of help you have never dreamed of. That coming help is Operation Uranus, the giant Soviet counterattack that's been building for weeks. On the night of the 18th of November, 1942, Stalingrad is quiet for a change. It's minus 25 degrees Celsius. Slowly the sun rose. The dimmed light seeped through the fog to create an unearthly twilight. Every soldier on each side knew that this day would decide their fate. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the Soviet men and women of Yudnikov's 138th Rifle Division gripped their weapons tightly, holding down their heads in anticipation of the expected artillery and air barrage. Both sides waited for the gods of war to open the gates of hell. The minutes crawled by on the wristwatches of the German assault group leaders without the usual roar of incoming artillery shells. The attack never came. For the Soviet counterattack, Operation Uranus has begun. There have been hiccups even this week. On the 17th, Joseph Stalin orders his chief of staff, Alexander Vasilevsky, to go to Moscow to a meeting of the GKO, the State Defense Committee, to discuss a plea to Stalin to call off the offensive. The plea is written by one of its main leaders, too, Vasily Volsky. A crisis is averted, though, and the attacks begin the 19th. The Soviets have over 1 million men on the Stalingrad axis. 13,541 big guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 planes deployed as follows, according to John Erickson. Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front has 18 rifle divisions, 3 tank corps, 2 cavalry corps, 1 tank and 1 motorized rifle brigade, and 8 artillery regiments in the 1st Guards, 5th Tank, 21st, and 17th Air Armies. Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don Front, the 65th, 24th, 66th, and 16th Air Armies, has 24 rifle divisions, 1 tank corps, 6 tank brigades, and 52 mortar and artillery regiments. And, of course, Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad Front, what's left of the 62nd and 64th Armies, the 57th, 51st, 28th, and the 8th Air Armies. They, too, number 24 rifle divisions, with 17 rifle or motorized rifle brigades, a cavalry corps, and 67 mortar and artillery regiments. I've talked about the plans and developments of this counteroffensive over past weeks, both here and in a special about it all. The 19th, the northern claw of the Red Army pincer attacks, 500,000 men strong. At 7:30 a.m. the 19th, the southwestern and Don Front artillery begins an 80-minute barrage, 3,500 guns and mortars on a 20-kilometer front. The infantry charge at 10 minutes to 9 with their armor support and crash into the Romanian army positions. By mid-morning, the fog disperses and the Red Air Force can fly. At noon, the rout begins. 3 Romanian divisions, 13th, 14th, and 9th, began to disintegrate and fell back in confusion and panic, pursued by 47th Guards, lifted on the back of the tanks of the 8th Guards Tank Brigade, and by tank columns beginning to break out into the Don Steppe. The whole of the Romanian 3rd Army, outflanked from the west and the east, was lifted right off its hinges. The Axis fight back, of course, or they try to. Plans are hastily made for German and Romanian armor to counterattack, but with the radio trucks of the 1st Romanian Armored Division knocked out, the 22nd Panzers lose touch with them, orders are not coordinated, and the Romanian armor drives to its doom as dawn arrives the 20th, accidentally running right into a mass of Soviet armor. The German armor has pulled back, and the Romanian 3rd Army is broken into pieces. Within 24 hours, 65,000 Romanians have been taken prisoner. That morning, the 20th, the southern claw of the pincer attacks. They attack the Romanian 4th Army and the elements of the German 4th Panzer Army that are not actually within Stalingrad. Fog delays the beginning of Yeremenko's attack, but at 10 a.m. the artillery barrage begins, and 45 minutes later, the armor and infantry move off from south of Beketovka and the Lake District. There are problems with coordination though, and once out on the featureless snowy steppe, some leaders lose their sense of direction. Still, by day and night they press on, and by today they have orders to reach Abganarovo station. Spoiler, they will reach it tomorrow morning, and a whole 35 kilometers wide from there to Tundutovo has been ripped into the flanks of the German 4th Panzer Army. The Axis are also being hit hard in the Caucasus. See, last week, Ewald von Kleist's offensive was called off, and his forces went on the defensive. And good thing they did, because Ivan Maslenikov's Soviet Northern Group, that's the 9th, 37th, and 44th Armies, begins attacks on his flanks. Maslenikov's force is getting markedly stronger, even as German Army Group A as a whole is diminishing in strength. Another spoiler. Maslenikov's attacks will continue for weeks. One attack that continues from last week into this week, but ends, is the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force that shelled Henderson Field at the very end of last week are heading south as morning arrives and this week begins. They are hit, though, by American planes, which sink heavy cruiser Kingasa and 511 men, and damaged 3 other cruisers, including Mikawa's flagship Chokai. That day, the 14th, Raizo Tanaka heads south early with his destroyers and his transports for a supply run. And he comes under heavy fire mid-morning by planes from Henderson Field and Carrier Enterprise. Actually, he has a nightmare of a day, as American planes keep on coming hour after hour. As darkness finally descends, his 11 transports that he began his mission with are now just 4 transports, but he perseveres, for Combined Fleet Commander Isoroku Yamamoto has ordered the landings to happen that night. The last round in the 3-day naval battle began with fears rising in Washington that the Marines might, after all, be forced to evacuate Guadalcanal. Halsey's entire hopes of stopping the Japanese rested on 2 battleships of Task Force 64, which he ordered to block the enemy advance. The Japanese cover force for Tanaka is now battlecruiser Kirishima, 4 cruisers and loads of destroyers led by Nobutake Kondo. Yamamoto has ordered them to sweep the area off Lunga and shell Henderson Field the night of the 14th. Task Force 64, under Willis Ching lead, is the Americans' answer to that. Battleships Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. Lee's force is heading southeast past Savo Island, and around 11 p.m., Washington's radar picks up the enemy. Japanese light cruiser Sendai is scouting in the lead, and at 11:17, Lee opens fire and Sendai is forced to retreat. The destroyer forces then join battle, and the Japanese send 2 of Lee's to the bottom of the sea and damage a 3rd at the cost of 1 of their own. Lee's battleships, now with just 1 escort, head between Savo and Cape Esperance. Kondo, however, refuses to believe one of his ship's reports that American battleships are out there north of Cape Esperance. They are, but there's a hitch. South Dakota has an electrical malfunction, and her turrets and generators go silent, and unaware of the proximity to the enemy, emerges from behind the island on course to run right into Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, and the Japanese destroyers. South Dakota gets power back, though, and is suddenly lit up by the enemy and shelled, taking 27 hits in 4 minutes, which causes considerable damage and starts several fires. But Washington isn't spotted and puts 9 16-inch salvos into Kirishima, wrecking her, jamming her rudders, and knocking her out of line. Kondo's flagship heavy cruiser Atago is already signaling withdrawal by this time and pulling away. Lee follows with Washington for 11 or so kilometers, but torpedo attacks by enemy destroyers on his now unescorted battleship make him turn back. 4 destroyers are still circling the wreck of the Kirishima in protection, but she is ordered scuttled at 3 a.m. While all of this is at its peak, Tanaka the Tenacious makes it to Tassafaranga with the transports he has left. To get his men ashore as quickly and safely as possible, he orders the transports run aground and speeds the destroyers up the slot to get as far away from Henderson Field as possible before dawn. When it arrives, the Cactus Air Force destroys the beach transports and strafes the soldiers on the beach, destroying a lot of their supplies. The end result of the fighting and shipping this week and last is that the enormous effort to resupply and reinforce Harukichi Hyakutake on Guadalcanal has pretty much failed. 10 tons of supply and 2,000 fresh troops have arrived, sure, but come on, it's cost the Japanese 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transports sunk. Yamamoto knows they cannot afford this sort of attrition. The Tokyo Express will still run, but nowhere nearly enough, especially now forced more and more to use submarines as supply ships, to sustain the 32,000 Japanese on Guadalcanal. On the flip side, the Americans have managed to bring in 5,529 men and tons of supplies during this same period. Bull Halsey, in overall naval command here, writes, "Unobstructed, the enemy would have driven south, or cut our supply lines to New Zealand or Australia and enveloped them. He had been advancing at his will. With Kondo's withdrawal, he believes this chapter of the war to be over." There are also small-scale American attacks on the island itself this week. The Japanese have not reoccupied their old line on the Matanikau River, and Marine Commander Alexander Vandegrift wants to hit them again. Local attacks go off the 18th and last into next week. The Americans will, in the end, dig in from Hill 66 to Point Cruz, and stalemate sets in. Well, Hyakutake might be, for the moment, stranded on Guadalcanal, but the Japanese are still on Papua New Guinea as well. On the 14th, Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur gives new orders to deal with that. Elements of the 126th American Infantry Division will be airlifted over the mountains to join the offensive against Buna, while the 7th Australian Division will focus on Gona. They think they have like 5,000 men or so to deal with, but since they are unable to really reinforce Guadalcanal, the Japanese will now be heavily reinforcing here. On the 17th, the Japanese land 1,000 fresh troops at Buna. The 19th, the Americans attack, but are easily defeated. The 20th, the Australians attack Gona and break into the Japanese positions, but are driven out again. And that brings me to the end of another busy week of the war, with a huge counteroffensive beginning near Stalingrad, a huge naval battle off Guadalcanal, and the Allies advancing on Tunisia from both east and west. Oh, and Operation Freshman goes off the 19th. This is a glider operation to try and hit the Vemork hydro plant in Norway, where the Germans are producing heavy water to hopefully run a nuclear reactor. The 2 gliders, however, along with one of their tow planes, crash land, and all those who survive the crashes are executed by the Germans under the Commando Order, which I've talked about before. But what in the world is going on? Let me go over it again, right? Okay. The Soviets are counterattacking at Stalingrad and holding the enemy in the Caucasus. The Allies have taken huge chunks of northwest Africa, and they're heading into Libya and Tunisia. France is falling, again. The Japanese are losing their navy and leaving men stranded on South Pacific islands. There must be something in the air, you know? Because right now, after all these months, things are suddenly looking way, way worse for the Axis powers. To learn more about Operation Freshman, Vemork, and the Heavy Water War, check out the episode Saboteurs that I did with the band Sabaton over on the Sabaton History channel. It's really good stuff, and you can check it out right here any second now. And to get ever more in-depth coverage of this ever-growing war, you should be just like our Time Ghost Army member of the week, Sarah Gilbert. And join us at timeghost.tv or patreon.com, because that is what pays for all of this. Do not forget to subscribe. Subscribe. See you next time.